Fantastic. Great, Robert. It's amazing to see you again. And in our last episode, decided to talk about strategy, and we were, at least I was, very mesmerized actually by this idea of strategy as a map. And the thing that I ask you is, sometimes people, organizations go for 1 or 2 year strategy, some do 5, and some do 10 years strategies. So it's going with that example of metaphor of a map. How big should this map be? Should we have a small map and then we navigate and update the map as we move on because the world is changing, or should we have a generic but a larger map? And if you recall, I said probably in this episode when we talk about strategy, you'll do more of the talking and I'll do more of the learning. So we'll see how it goes. So what are your thoughts on that?
So first of all, I'm not sure about the learning and listening. Maybe both will happen. Secondly, strategy is really my favorite subject. It is the thing which I have been fascinated by all of my life and had the real privilege of looking at. And third, I'll just start with a definition before we start talking about maps, because I really like this metaphor of the map that came up in our last conversation. But before that, so what is strategy? And for me, my definition of strategy is that it is the thing which explains achieving more than could be reasonably expected. So if you're really good at something, you'd expect to do well at it. When you've got lots of advantages, if you're the biggest company or you have the biggest market share or you have the most people or the best talent, or you'd expect to win. And so strategy is the thing which explains when that doesn't happen, when the outsider, when the disruptive, when the new company, when the new entrant wins. You usually find yourself retrospectively thinking they've had a really clever strategy to get that result, so that more than can be reasonably expected.
So the strategy is the plan to win. You say use your strength and whatever is available for you, so you leverage them and align them in a way so that you can win. Yes. Okay. I think that's very good.
So let's just persist with that for a second longer before we come to maps and mapping. So strategies usually have 2 or 3 core components to them. One is some sense of objective or a plan or a goal, or, we want to be the fastest growing or the biggest or the best, or, So there's something about intentions and goals. There's something about the external environment. So there's something about reading what's changing in the landscape and why. So as fewer customers buy this thing, they're going to have to buy that thing instead. And you predict that, the transition from analog to digital, or from software as product to software as services, or so there's something about the landscape and forecasting, and so that is important. And then there's also something about skill set. So what do you have to be good at in order to be competitive? And that introduces a fourth thing, which is, who are you competing with?
Right.
Okay, so across these, you don't need very much more than that. There are lots of more elaborate settings of what strategy is, but what are you trying to achieve? What's going on around you? Who might you be competing with? And how are you going to compete? They're a really good set of core questions about strategy, right? And then if you apply that to this idea which came up in our last conversation of strategies as maps, then the idea of strategy as a plan, which is what is most often in our head, our strategy is this pre-crafted plan of, I'll do this, then that, then this, then that, and we will succeed. Gets into difficulty because the real world around us doesn't react or respond in the same way that we expected. So there's a very famous phrase from the world of military strategy that plans and strategies get into difficulty on first contact with the enemy. So when you encounter the real world and your competitor does something unexpected, or your customer doesn't buy the thing you'd expected them to buy, you have to respond.
Or everyone has a plan and until they get punched in the face, right?
So that famous phrase from a former world heavyweight boxing champion, who said, because the reporter was saying, but Mushtak is going to win the world title because he says he's got a plan, and Joe Louis, who
Mike
was the then
Tyson, right?
world champion, says,
Was it
everyone says they've got a
Mike
plan,
Tyson?
then I punch them in the face.
Right. Was it Mike Tyson or?
Well, originally it was Joe Louis, who's
Oh,
much, much
right.
older. And then
Right.
Mike
Okay.
Tyson said the same thing. And he gets, because there was more publicity, he gets more credit. But it was actually
Right.
Joe Louis who said,
Okay. Okay.
everyone says they've a plan until I punch them in the face. And it's quite a
Yes.
brutal thing, but it conveys this sense of unexpected and, actually having to do it rather than just theoretically having to do it.
That's right.
So in that context, everybody often thinks of the plan as this thing which is the strategy. And
Mm,
for me, the strategy as a map of the terrain is a really nice metaphor because it tells you I've got this journey to undertake and I'm using this map to try and understand what the landscape looks like, what's the best route, what's the fastest, what's the cheapest,
mm,
what's the most efficient, what do I want to do here.
mm,
And the other thing that I really liked from our last conversation was this idea that maps are not a singular thing.
mm,
Like in hundreds of years ago, they were a singular thing. They were a big paper document that someone had produced. But these days, even people as old as you and I, Mushtak, interact with digital maps. And
right.
the students that we teach have only ever really known that. And so they're used to, on a device, being able to say, I want to see the rail network. No, I want to see the satellite image. No, I want to see the road network. And you see these different versions or layers in the map. And what that made me think between that conversation and today's conversation is, of course, I'm sure you've also had the experience of discovering in your car that it says, oh, your maps are not up to date when you're driving along and you realize the road you want to take no longer exists or the
Mm,
junction isn't there. So there's this thing about the permanency or temporariness of the map and how up to date it is, which I think then takes to your opening question of how long is it sensible to plan for? And
mm,
you started by saying, well, some companies talk about 1 or 2 years, some even
yeah.
talk about 10 years. In
Yes.
some companies and in some traditions, it's not uncommon to say, what's our 100-year plan or our 50-year plan?
Okay.
And there's a real tension in that because one part of that is, well, we have to have some really ambitious long-term purposeful goal which defines what we're trying to do. And we plan to take 100 years to do that.
Mm,
On the other hand, our lived experience, particularly in the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 or 6 years, is the rate of unexpected changes that are seismic has just been off the charts. Whether
mhm,
you think about the pandemic and the huge impact that that's had on hybrid working, whether you think about the geopolitical situation and the number of conflicts that we just would not have predicted, certainly did not predict, that
mm,
have disrupted supply chains and then made us much more conscious. So we've been for a few decades now in a process of globalizing. And I think in the last 3 or 4 years, because of the pandemic and then because of some conflicts, we've realized the exposure that we have about these interdependent supply chains, where if you
mm,
can't get the components from over there to over here, you know, at the moment, right as we're recording this, that's related to a conflict in the Middle East and the
right.
Strait of Hormuz. But before the conflict, there was a big tanker that got stuck. Do you remember? And it blocked the canal for a period of few days.
Yes. Yeah, the Swiss Canal. Yes, I remember that. Yes, you're
The
right.
Suez
Yeah,
Canal was blocked, and because of that, global supply chains were really, really disrupted.
that's
And
right.
it impacted on all of our lives in really practical ways. Like, I can't
Right.
get the spare component to service your car because it's on a boat, which is stuck behind the one that got stuck. So
That's right.
there have been all of these changes in the last 4 or 5 years, which I think have been really, really dramatic, actually. So
Mm.
what on earth would you be thinking about predicting the next 100 years for when you can't really predict what the year ahead is going to look like?
So,
And
so
that,
Robert, probably what you are saying, actually, you mentioned purposeful goal, and I think that word purpose, maybe the purpose map could be a bit longer,
yeah,
and then maybe, yeah, okay, great. I think
yeah.
I see where you're
And that's
going.
a really
Okay,
nice connection that the,
yeah,
the
yeah.
purpose is another layer or filter through
Mm,
which you look at the map.
mm, mm,
But here's my kind of contribution to the conversation about strategy. I think strategy really, really matters, not just because I've written about it for most of my life and I've been a professor of strategy and I'm very proud to do that, but because I think it really matters. But the thing that is misunderstood is it matters, but not in the way that people expect it to.
mhm,
So, in my humble opinion, novice strategists people who are new to strategy imagine that it is about the eloquence, the accuracy, and the cleverness of the plan. So all I need is a really good map, and I'll get my way from A to B, with B
Mm,
is some long-term ambition to be the best in the country or the best in the world or the most profitable. And that's not actually what matters. Go back
mm,
to our thing about everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. The plan isn't about the kind of predictive power of where you're going to be in the future. It's about the preparation that it does to your subconscious so that across these things which I mentioned at the beginning, what are you going to be good at? What are your competitors doing? What's changing in the landscape? What are you trying to achieve? As you try to achieve and deliver and walk your way across the path that you've identified in your plan, undoubtedly things will go wrong or astray or will surprise you.
mm,
And only because you've got a plan can you reflect on what's what I expected and what's not what I expected. And so it's
mm,
that preparatory sensitizing that the plan actually does. I mean, it's vanishingly rare for the plan to just work perfectly as expected.
mm.
And so,
Actually,
as you're,
actually, Robert, if I were to stop you here and ask you, because there's a question that has always been on my mind. I think if you do a Google search, um, or an academic search on the papers that talks about uh, how effective or how much actually strategies work, I think the evidence is that most likely the thing that you put in your strategy, most of the time they will not
yeah,
work out the way that you put them.
yeah. So the
So
literature tells you that it's about 60 to 80% of the time
that doesn't work, right? It
it
doesn't
doesn't
work the
work.
way it was planned.
Doesn't
And
that's the key phrase? It doesn't work out as originally planned.
as originally planned, yes. And I continue to ask myself, actually, as a matter of fact, I once asked someone who was working on a strategy, and I said, look, let's just think about this. You know, and I think you're right. It was 60-80%, which is actually a very big number. So why would people have strategies if they most likely will not work as they planned or as they originally planned, as you put it? And the person just told me, well, other places don't have great people as the people that we have in this room. So that's why it didn't work for them. So, I mean, it's half jokingly, but it's also really
Yeah,
close the conversation. And I really would like you, if you don't mind, to tease out this point again. So you put something, it may not work, but it still have a convening sort of power. It's almost like, you know, the story that you told in a previous episode about this general, army general, were stuck somewhere, and although he had the wrong plan, but it helped galvanize people around him. But anyway, I would like you to really
yeah,
explain it again. You know, the
yeah,
benefit of having a strategy, although 60 to 80% of the strategies will not work as originally planned.
yeah. So I'll just start with I've said a few times in these conversations I like quotes. So Henry Mintzberg, the academic who's very well published in this space, he has a great quote which he says, "When strategic plans fail, the people at the top of the organization, whether they're the generals or the presidents or the chief executives, they tend to say, this was a brilliant plan. It's only these people below us who goofed and, the quote is, these dumbbells didn't understand and didn't execute as well as.
Mm.
Right? And then the quote goes on to say, whereas the people further down in the organization's hierarchy might say, if you're so brilliant, why didn't you take into account the fact that we're dumbbells?
Mm. Absolutely, yes, yes. But these people also, those who are lower in the organization, could look up and say the plan was perfect, but just the leaders were not clever
Yeah,
enough, were not
yeah,
competent enough. You're
yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah.
And so you get to this 60 to 80% failure rate because both of those things could be true. It could be the looking down was wrong, the looking up was wrong. And in the interim period, one of these major disruptions happened. Our
Mm,
competitors introduced a product that was a tenth of the price and 5 times more effective. And we just,
mm,
that blew us out of the water, or the regulator said you can no longer do this. So So go back to your question as to, what is the purpose of a plan and why would you bother? It is about this sensitizing of your ability to react to your competitors, to the marketplace, to your own skill set and motivations and
Mm,
the purpose that you have. And only by having a plan do you have some relatively fixed benchmark against which you can say, well, what is working here and what is not working here?
mm,
And then take that to this conversation about how long term or short term. I do
yeah.
think these days you need to have a relatively quick refresh cycle as checking in. Sometimes
Mm,
that's a quarterly performance review, sometimes it's an annual health check. But even if you've got a 5, 10, 15, 50-year strategy, you need to have those shorter term adjustments. And those adjustments then are a renegotiation about what things stay unchanged. Maybe the long term purpose of the organization, it
mm,
stays unchanged. Maybe the skill set stays unchanged, but maybe the who we're competing with and why we're doing that, that changes. And I said
mm,
in our very first conversation, I think one of the key skills for somebody doing strategy work is about framing. So the
yes.
willingness to genuinely rethink, I don't think we're in the education business. I think we're in the employment business.
Mm,
We're a
mm,
university. That's actually a really subtle but a really significant change.
mm,
How we do, what we do, who we compete with, how we service, what we need to be good at. That's just an
right.
example, but in any given situation, a subtle shift like that on any one of 3 or 4 key questions. Who are we competing with? What are we trying to achieve? What do we need to be good at? What's changing in the landscape? A really subtle shift in any one of those can produce a really dramatic shift in the whole conception of what our map is telling us we should do next.
So Robert, I have a thought here. Actually, it just occurred to me. You and I have been through multiple times where our organizations were developing strategies. Of course, you yourself led multiple other teams in developing their strategies, and often the process takes us through who are our competitors, who we are, what is our strength, what is the terrain, and all of that. But then when we produce the final product, it is very beautifully done, very glossy, and it is sometimes it does not, and it has KPIs and key performance indicators and all of that, but it does not still reflect to the material that contributed to creating the strategy, which is what is the terrain, what are our strengths, what we are producing here, who are the competitor, and so on. And that's why when the refresh comes, it's a refresh to the product. But what you are saying is the refresh needs to go back and ask the same original questions and see if there is change there. And honestly, I don't know. Probably this is my second next question to you. I personally haven't seen people re-asking the questions that led them to the 10-page document that they put it on the website and all of that, because now we are just tinkering with the metrics. But I'm feeling actually what we need to do is to go back and ask the question. So first, what is your reflection? And second, have you seen people really going back to ask these questions? And also, how do you communicate this internally? Because there will always people saying, "Oh, the management spent so much money on this question. They asked us last year, and now you look there, look at them. These guys that they don't know what they're doing and they're asking the same questions again, keep on wasting our time and keep on wasting our resources." So sorry, it's multiple questions in one question. So over to you to
I'll
respond.
try and untangle some of the multiple questions. First, an observation. In my view, good practice is to listen really hard to everybody who's involved in the organization and some of those around, so who your customers are, who your suppliers are, and so on. And we've both worked at universities that, not huge universities, but even small universities are more than 1,000 people, right?
Yes.
So if you give 1,000 people even 3 or 4 post-it notes and ask them to write down who are you competing with, what you're trying to achieve, what do you think we need to be good at, you've already got 4,000 or 5,000 bits of information, right? So the transition from that to some 10-page glossy diagram with some KPIs is an editorial process, and that should be done participatively, but it almost inevitably means that not every member of the community that produced the original map can say, I see myself in this. And I do think that actually in the last 5 to 10 years, the technology to allow us to do mass consultation, to have big digital meetings, to have voting, to have, those kinds of activities, they're much more effective now than they used to be. But there is definitely a transition from a participative crowdsourced to an edited top-down. That's the first observation. Second observation, going back to this checking back, no, it's not so common to go back mid-strategic period, whether that's 5 years or 3 years, and say, is this still right? Partly because there's a degree of saving face about that. Nobody really wants to say, well, this was a really stupid idea. How do I unpick this now? But there are some really great examples, I think, out there if you read case studies of other organizations that, for example, Microsoft, a global firm, at one point in the early days of the internet was thinking of what was then called MSN, the Microsoft Network, as a competitor to the internet. So they saw this as a gated community that would be a protected, safe space in which you could transact and interact without any of the risks of viruses and bad actors. And so they were pushing that idea. And the then still chief executive, I think, Bill Gates, had an exchange with some relatively junior colleagues in Microsoft who pointed out to him that this was it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle and the free version of the internet as a platform existed. And so he issued an instruction to every software developer and coder and programmer in Microsoft to say, I want you to stop thinking about this way of conceptualizing this map of MSN as a protected legal community that we would sell services via, and think about how it sits on the intranet or the internet and develop a different version of that. And that's where the online versions of what was Microsoft Office became products that you could do in a cloud-based way. And so that's a really good example. I wasn't at Microsoft at the time. Maybe someone listening to this was and will say that's not what actually happened. I'll come back to that in a second. But it's a really good story in at least illustrating a significant investment in one version of the world and then redrawing the map and thinking, oh, this doesn't make sense to us anymore. We should definitely do something else instead. If you do that, even if you do that, there is still this process of consulting and bringing people with you and trying to explain why we've made some adjustments or we've not made some adjustments. But I said I'd come back to one thing, and it's a recurring theme in our conversations, not just these podcasts over the decade or so that we've been talking. Stories are really important. So the way in which you get a complicated set of ideas about which technology in which country with which competitors under which regulation and what business model will make us competitive is you tell a little story that you can sum up in a soundbite that becomes infectious and that people buy into. And so if you think about the really big brand names, and I won't name them because for each person listening, they'll have some product or service or brand that they feel an affection for and that they're impressed by. But the way in which we form those impressions is almost always to do with little stories about what we do and why we do it, why it matters, why it's special. And so you have this transition from thousands of post-it notes and individual ideas into a much slicker, glossier thing. And the process of doing that needs to also have alongside it an ability to tell stories and narratives about why being good at this thing is so important to us that we'll continue to do it even if we're not making money just now. Or why we'll do it even if we're not currently the best in class at it just now, because we see this longer term picture and purpose which connects to this idea of achieving more than could be reasonably expected.
So I think then the purpose becomes so important because that needs an agreement upon. People need to, at all levels of the organization, need to agree with, to feel energized by, and feel that they are there to mobilize it and to be behind it. But then, the even at the development uh, process of that editorial process, probably people need to say, or the leaders need to say, I'm going to come back and recheck this, and maybe re-ask some of the questions, because maybe our competitor was A and B, but in 3 months there will be a competitor C who have killed A and B and is about to kill us as well. So there's no
Yeah.
point to say, no, we have this glossy document that we spend so much money and time on. There's no way we are changing it.
Yeah.
But then the stories also kick in. So that's how we keep all of that. So I think probably what you are saying here is we still need the long term. And then we need to be very agile on the short term, and also to have the humility that 80%, 60 to 80%, there's a 60 to 80% chance that the stuff that we put at the beginning will not work out as planned, but it's still very important. I think that is probably the biggest challenge for leaders, to continue telling that story, keep the team with them and behind them and in front of them. So I think probably that's in a nutshell what you are trying to say.
Yeah. And so can I connect this to an earlier conversation in this series, which one of the reasons it's about long term is because to achieve something really significant usually
Mm,
doesn't happen overnight,
right.
regardless of whether it's a business or a musician or
Mm,
an author or a
yeah.
politician. Overnight success is when you read their biography is always, I spent a decade doing this thing and then suddenly it worked. Right?
Yes.
And so in
Yeah.
an earlier conversation, we talked about that becoming world class and this idea of 2.75 hours a day for 10 years is 10,000 hours.
Mm,
So that's one of the reasons that it has to have this long term persistence and purpose. Because
yeah.
in order to be really, really good at something, it takes time and effort to get good at it.
Mm, mm,
As you're doing that, the landscape around you changes. In a 10-year period, it changes remarkably. I mean, look at the difference in our operating environment over 10 years. It's just
mm.
unbelievable.
That's right.
But somehow you've got to then improvise and think, this skill set, which I've spent my lifetime building up, how do I redeploy this in
Mm,
some creative, innovative, improvised way in the circumstances here and now, where I
mm,
realize that using this, but not as originally intended, oh, that works. So
mm.
there's this openness to feedback in the moment about what's actually working and what's actually
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah.
And I think I said stories are important. Stories are also hugely problematic for one particular reason, which is they are narrated by a convincing, compelling, charismatic storyteller retrospectively. And we all have this massive tendency to want to look heroic. So when you come across the billionaire or the number one selling artist or the biggest, most profitable chief executive,
Mm,
they almost always tell you, so I did this thing, it just worked. And then look at me. Look how
yeah.
fabulous. Look at all my
Yes.
gold medals and world records. What they don't say is, yeah, this didn't work, then that didn't work, then this. Then I had this really lucky break, and then I used this skill which I had 5 years ago to do this thing which I no longer expected to be useful, but it turned out to be amazing.
That's right. That's right. No, I think these are like amazing conversations, and I really think maybe we will come back to them in the future. So I wanted to maybe in closing is to also talk for a bit about individual strategy. Not everyone is listening to us. Not every one of our students is a chief executive or person work within a bigger team, but I think, and I want to check this with you, what works for organizations works for people. People also need to do what is their strength, who are they competing with, what is available in the terrain, and what is their purpose. So first, do you think it's a good idea that one of our students will be graduating next July or after that, to have a strategy and a bit of sort of self-reflection? Do you think universities are encouraging individuals to build strategies for themselves? So first, is the strategy applicable, important for individual? Are we as educators doing enough to help people have their own strategies, and maybe a little bit of reflection of even scholars of strategy, do they have a personal strategy? So this is the three questions.
That's three questions.
Hmm,
So yes, not really, and yes, and I'll explain my answers. Okay.
please.
So question one, does this apply to individuals as well as organizations and nation states and, you know, absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm,
And I don't think we do enough to recognize that, because most of the writing and teaching of strategy relates to organizational units, which are
mm,
sports teams or companies or boards of directors. And
mm,
they are really interesting places to look. But don't forget that that applies to each of us individually.
mm,
So that's my yes. My no, your second question, do universities do enough to help people build strategies? And your question was very particular. It was, our students?
yes.
Not really.
Mm,
So I think what we do is we run skill sessions and how to do CV sessions, and your own work at Heriot Watt in particular around impact statements, I think, is much closer to an actual strategy than just a how do I get my first job strategy.
mm, mm,
So I think we prepare students for the workplace a little bit by getting them to think about how they will navigate from the classroom through the recruitment process into their first job.
right.
But here's my take, and it doesn't actually just apply to students, it would apply to people who are much older and at all
Mm,
stages of their life,
mm,
actually. What's your personal strategy? And I'll
mm,
use me as an example. So if you want to get to a particular kind of job or to achieve a particular kind of work-life balance or a particular set of skills, or you want to run a marathon or whatever it is that you want to do, then you could develop a strategy for that. And that
mm,
strategy would ask very similar questions. What would you need to be good at? What's changing in the landscape? Why are you motivated to do that? And who would you be competing with?
yep. Yep.
I know they're really obvious questions when you talk about Microsoft versus Google. They're
Yep.
much subtler questions when you talk about Robert versus Mushtak.
Yep.
But here's a very crystallized example, which I don't think we do enough of for our student audience.
Mm,
Not what job would you like to get when you graduate, right? Because we do a bit of that. But if you said to them, say 7 years after you graduate, what do you actually want to be doing? And if they could tell you really purposefully, I'd like to be running my own business, employing 100 people, turning over this many million ringgits, or that's a very particular thing.
mm,
And then you could say, hmm, is that option A what you would naturally expect to happen? Or
mm,
option B, you'd be achieving much more than could be reasonably expected? If it's option A, just go ahead and work hard and it'll probably happen. If it's something that was much more than could be reasonably expected, you better have a strategy.
that's right.
And in your strategy, you have to think, who's most likely to end up running that company or in that job or with that particular set of skills or resources? And how will I compete with them? So, what will
Mm,
I need to be good at, and what will I have to do that they won't see coming?
mm,
And so, we don't do that conversation about individual aspirations and how to be strategic in
mm,
those. So, that's why I said into question two, not really.
mm, mm.
And you'll have to remind me, what was the third question?
So the third question is for a person who teaches strategy. Do
Do I
we
have a strategy?
have a strategy? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
I ended up recruited to the university that I currently work for as a pro vice chancellor for research.
Yep.
And I would say that I'm quite good at research. I'm
Mm,
not absolutely outstanding at research because I've done other things in my career. So when I look at people who are pro vice chancellors of research in universities, they are often outstanding researchers.
mm,
So I had to have a strategy to think, how am I going to get into a job that I'm interested in doing when
mm,
I'm not the best researcher in the whole of the university? And so
mm,
part of my answer is I would bring to that experience that I've got about leadership and strategy and change. And to offset the deficit, to be blunt, the deficit in my research grant income or my H index, which are measures of how often your work is cited by other people, I have to have some positives. And so the positives for me, I would bring experience from executive and non executive chairing roles inside and outside of universities. That's a bit
mm,
unusual. I'd bring to that 30 years worth of studying strategy, change, and leadership. That's a bit unusual.
Mhm.
And so that's my strategy for getting into the line of work that I got into was I'll be better at things that you're not likely to be nearly as good at me as.
Right.
And I'll use that to disrupt the nature of the how will I compete question. How will I compete with these people? Because if the answer is I have to go and get a whole succession of 5 or 10 million pound research awards, which have taken them 20 or 30 years, they're always going to be ahead of me.
Yes.
So you
Mm.
see the way in which this process applies at every life stage
Yeah.
in your work life and in your domestic life. And it
Mm.
applies at the level of the individual, but you have to be quite thoughtful about what does that actually require of you?
Mm. So this is actually very very enlightening, and paradoxically, to your earlier observation, where you want to see yourself in 7 years or 10 years from today, do you see yourself just working for a firm, which is probably you don't need much of it's great. You still need a strategy to do it at a certain level, but even without a strategy, maybe you will still be joining a company or a firm and then get promoted and so on. But if you really want to do something that's different and make a bigger difference and achieve bigger success, then you better have a strategy. So paradoxically, I think the world will be more like option B rather than option A because the disruption is so high. So the strategy becomes even more important. And probably that 60 to 80% will still be there. So we need to train our students and our children and ourselves that you will write a strategy, and when with it works only 40% of the time, you don't say I've wasted my time writing it, because this actually has helped you one way or another to do, because it's a requirement almost to do that. So I think that is quite enlightening, actually, I feel, and I find it helpful myself.
So I'm going to say two things, then I think we'll transition to what our next conversation might be about. One, I'm going to pick up a very particular thing that you said. So you said write a strategy. You didn't say have a strategy. And I
Right.
think that is a really subtle but really important point.
Yeah.
We all fall into conversations over coffee or over a meal or at the water cooler or
Mm,
when we're at
mm,
work or at play with our friends or colleagues about what we might do. And
right.
that's really useful. It's interesting and engaging and very human. But only a subset of people actually write it down. And something
Mm,
really profound happens when you commit it to paper. The
that's right.
physical act of saying, I would do this with these people to develop this skill set, to address this opportunity in a changing landscape that I see like this. That's map making. Whereas the
Mm,
other thing is just talking, and it's so elusive that it simultaneously it might have a really profound impact on you, and 3 minutes later you might have completely forgotten your train of thought.
that's
And a
right.
year later you're not going to be able to go back and say, is this still right? So writing a strategy is not the same
Mm,
thing as thinking about or talking about,
yep.
and it's really important. Right? That's the
Yep.
first thing. And then the second thing I think that's really important about strategy is that it applies to ambition. And so there's a relationship between achieving what you would expect to happen, which might still be hard work and really tough and really demanding, which I would describe as map reading. Like I need to
Mm,
figure out how to get across this in a new city, how to use their metro system to get from here to here. I have to change lanes twice. I have to buy a particular type of ticket. That's okay. It's still hard work, but it's
mm,
okay. Right? It's what you would expect a bright, intelligent person to be able to figure out for themselves. There's a difference between map reading and map making. So we've used
mm,
in this conversation the metaphor of maps a lot. Where did maps come from? So centuries ago, when nobody had ever been to that bit of the world before, maps came from someone going along, measuring, taking pictures, drawing something that said, oh, so there's a river here, there's a hill there, there's a valley there, there's trees here, and they drew. So that's called cartography, the process of building a map.
mm,
I think the future is going to belong much more to map builders than map readers because the world is
mhm,
changing so fast.
mm. That's so true. Yeah. And you said we will talk about what will we be talking about next time we meet? And we talked about leadership, and in the couple of episodes that we had earlier, we talked about the uncertainty that actually almost is a companion for leadership, and how that could lead to an imposter syndrome. And I kept on thinking about that, and I thought of what other things leaders do. And one of the things that successful and good leaders do is to be able to assemble teams of people who are better than themselves, and keep these teams of ambitious, clever people motivated, believing in the purpose, staying with them. So I wanted to talk about next time when we meet, about how to assemble and keep such a team motivated, people who are cleverer than the leader themselves. I thought that was something that we could think about and talk about.
So I think that's a brilliant subject for conversation, but I'm going to suggest a little nuance to it, which comes from this conversation. So I too have heard some really, really impressive chief executives and presidents and so on of different organizations have that line of thought, which is my job is mostly to hire people who are much more talented than me and get out of their way. And there's a confidence and humility about that, which is a really interesting space for us to talk in. But let's not forget that that is still an organizational space. So how do I build a team around me who are together with our university leadership team, or in this company, or in this political party, trying to achieve this more than could be reasonably expected? And the nuance that I wanted to introduce from this conversation is, what does that mean at the level of an individual?
Mm.
Right? In your whole of your life,
Yep.
regardless of whether you're a young student or an aging academic or somewhere in between, or you're now retired, there's the same process of surrounding your life by people who are more talented than you, and actively being open to learning and being challenged and being
Mm.
outthought and outsmarted by them.
Mm.
And that is not that you could do one or both of those things. You could have really brilliant people at work and no really brilliant people in your life, and
Mm.
vice versa, or you could have both. But if I've just said in this conversation that we should all have a strategy because we should all be purposeful and trying to achieve something
Mm.
bigger in our life, that's a personal view, then you have to think about what's the non-team, non-co-worker, non-organizational version of surround yourself with really brilliant people.
Mm. I really like that. And actually, I dare say I am already doing this right now by being connected with you, Robert, because you're much cleverer than I am, and I'm learning from you all the time.
Yeah. And you say that to everybody, Mushtak. Whereas I will also be much more controversial and say, I need a much better podcast co-host.
Well, when you can afford someone like that, then be my guest.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
But I think
That
that'll be
was
a really
great.
brilliant conversation.
I'm sure it will be. So thank you very much, and we'll stop here. And I look forward to our
Yeah.
next conversation.
Thanks, Mushtak.
Thank you very much.